So this is somewhat of a follow-up lesson, if not some new techniques for you to practice while learning how to drift. I would definitely recommend pairing this with my original training video, as there is some overlap in techniques, and I'll include a link for that in the description below, or maybe in this general vicinity. This particular lesson is going to focus a lot on donuts, which can seem a little ridiculous or rudimentary when you're first starting out, and especially when you're seeing videos of people ripping these super technical courses, but they're actually a really great technique to build a lot of the fundamentals that are going to help you down the road. And if nothing else, you can go to your local takeover and do donuts in the middle of an intersection like a douchebag. In the last video, I also touched on transitions at a really high level, and this one digs a bit deeper into that as well, since I know that's something a lot of new folks tend to struggle with, but let's jump into the lesson. I like to pick tracks that are available on console so everyone can follow along, and in this particular case, I chose Silverstone Grand Prix because it has some wide skid pad type areas. There are probably better spots for this. Silverstone is literally just the first one I came across, and before anyone asks, the Z is a private mod running on Death Wish Garage 350Z physics. If you don't have access to mods, I recommend the BMW E92 Drift. So on Silverstone, drive into what I guess would technically be turn 3, and on turn 3 there's a pretty big runoff area, which conveniently for us is essentially just a huge patch of asphalt, which for the more traditional among us does a great job of simulating, let's say, a Walmart parking lot. Don't drift in Walmart parking lots. I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but I also have to say it. Now get yourself to a wide part of the skid pad, cut your steering wheel all the way to the left or right, it really doesn't matter. Rev it up and pop the clutch. Hold the steering wheel steady and do a couple of rotations while modulating the throttle to stay within your hypothetical power band. Don't just bounce off the rev limiter like this. Once you're good and dizzy, get into your same donut and then just straight up let the steering wheel go. What you'll find is that the car wants to countersteer itself out of the donut, and maybe you inadvertently did a cool little drift, or maybe you crashed into a wall. This was just a quick example to show your car's natural tendency to countersteer, but here forward you want to let the steering wheel slide through your hands like this instead of letting it go completely. Now that was literally the most stereotypical donut possible, which in itself isn't considered drifting. What starts to turn a donut into a drift is adding countersteer, which is what we're going to work on now. I fully expect that you're going to need to pause and revisit a lot of these steps, so try not to get frustrated if you aren't getting it the first time. I mean, these steps might look easy, but there's a lot of coordination and muscle memory that goes into each one. So just keep at it and eventually it'll start to click, but pep talk over, let's add some countersteer. Starting with the same steps as before, get into a donut and then let the steering wheel slide through your hands a bit. And this time, catch it while you continue modulating the throttle. What you'll notice is that once I catch the wheel, I'm keeping it in a pretty consistent zone, and essentially combined with throttle inputs, I'm making small adjustments to extend the radius of the donut. One more time, get into the donut, release the wheel, catch it, and nudge in towards the center of the donut to extend the drift while modulating the throttle. You'll find there are a few ways you can make adjustments here with a balance of both wheel and throttle inputs. But essentially you'll either be looking to increase or decrease angle. When you want to increase angle, the main things you're going to do are either turn or nudge in towards the center of the corner with your steering wheel, increase throttle to bring the rear end around, or ideally a fine combination of both. You can see that here as I'm nudging the steering wheel in and getting a little bit deeper into throttle to increase angle and avoid that patch of grass. On the opposite side, to decrease angle, you're going to want to let the car countersteer itself away from the turn, or you're going to want to come off throttle to let the rear tires catch some grip. You can see I'm making a few micro adjustments here where I'm letting the wheel slide back through my hands in small increments to widen out the donut, but you probably also notice that I'm making adjustments in both directions. So it really is a fine balance, and especially when you're doing donuts in first gear, it tends to be really twitchy. The graphic here is a super general rule of thumb for you to follow, but really spend some time trying to find your balance in this step. Play around with adding and subtracting steering angle and throttle to try and build an understanding of how these adjustments change your trajectory. And then once you get comfortable here, your next goal is to move up to the same techniques, but in second gear. Second to me generally feels a lot more stable and like it requires a lot less of those micro adjustments you see me doing in first. It may or may not be the opposite for you, but realistically, second gear is where you're going to spend a bulk of your time on a drift course, barring some super short or super long gearing. So spend some time getting to the point where you can consistently hold a second gear donut in both directions, and then we'll go to the next step, which is figure eights. And this is where things really start to turn more into drifting because you're going to start practicing your first weight transfers. So get yourself into a stable countersteer donut. You can do as many loops as you want if that's your happy place, but once you're ready, steer away from the center of your donut in the next direction you want to travel, like this, and that's going to initiate your transition. You'll notice I let the wheel countersteer quite a bit before I made the catch, and also momentarily came off throttle to let the rear catch some grip to avoid spinning out. There's no magic formula or trick to this, it's just a matter of practice and getting a feel for how the car is going to react. So again, steering towards my next turn, let the car countersteer, ease back on throttle, then get right back into my donut. And there are a few things that can go wrong here, the first of which being too much throttle or too little countersteer, which is going to cause you to spin, and the second being too little throttle or too much countersteer, which is either going to cause you to straighten out or snap back in the opposite direction. In the last video, I had flexed a little bit by drifting one-handed, so I figured why not kick it up a notch and come off even more dickish by drifting with no hands at all. In similar scenario, it's really just meant to illustrate a point, and that being how important throttle control is to transitions. So I start my drift, and you can see I'm letting the car fully countersteer itself. The only thing I'm doing is adding momentum with the throttle as the rear starts to move in each direction. Even if I was adding more input to the steering, you would probably find that my throttle control would look very similar. And again, this is just an example before we move to the next step, which is a slalom or S pattern. So for this step, you're going to initiate your drift in the same way you did the donuts. You can even start from a donut if that makes you feel more comfortable, but you do want to eventually break that dependency. Nonetheless, the pattern we're looking for here is half donut, transition, half donut, transition. And if you spend a bunch of time learning those figure eights, you'll probably find this step more accessible since all the hand motions you've been learning have been adding up to this. If not, you're going to have a bad time. So jumping in, I'm going to initiate my drift essentially in the same way I did the donuts and the figure eights. Then countersteer, steer in my next direction. Countersteer, steer into my next direction. Keep an eye on my throttle inputs as well, as I am easing off during the transitions as I mentioned earlier. And one more time, but at the end of this one I'm going to transition into a longer sweeper to start varying up my lines, which is something you'll want to do as you start getting some of these base techniques down. So once you're good on this step, start jumping into some actual drift tracks. I would very much recommend revisiting this spot on the drift track where you can do a longer oval type donut into a sweeper. And then there's this other really great line for practicing transitions on varying size turns from that more quick S to the two longer sweepers at the end. And once you get these basic techniques down, you can start applying them to basically any of the drift cars or tracks in the game. As with anything you're learning, patience is key. I mean, you can watch me, you can research and know all the steps by heart and still not be able to hold a drift. I mean, as an example, I know how to play a guitar right-handed, but if I tried to play a left-handed guitar, it's like I've never played music in my life. So you really just need to build that muscle memory. As I mentioned earlier, spend some time on each of these steps. I mean, I really wouldn't recommend progressing to the next one until you're able to consistently nail the previous. I know the whole donut thing is gonna feel kind of lame, but it works, I promise. And on the bright side, all your takeover friends are gonna be super impressed when you're drifting in the middle of an interstate like a complete and total dick. Anyway, I'm always happy to answer any questions in the comments or on Discord, and I'll see you next time.